You know, it's funny. Have you ever noticed how the most massive, game-changing ideas often start with the simplest questions? It's not some crazy, complex formula. Nope, it's just a two-word phrase that has this incredible power to unlock innovation, to shield us from disaster, and yeah, to completely reshape our reality. So let's dive into how it works.
I want you to really let that sink in for a second. What if a single, simple question could be the one thing that stands between a total failure and a billion-dollar success? Between an absolute catastrophe and being completely safe? Because it absolutely can be. And that question is just, what if?
I mean, just look at Slack. Here you have a company that was pretty much on the brink of total failure, but instead of just packing it in, they started to explore a different possibility. They looked at this little internal tool they built for themselves and asked that one simple generative question. And the result? It wasn't just a pivot, it was the birth of a company that completely redefined how we all communicate at work. That is the kind of power we're talking about here.
So how does this actually work in our brains? Well, first, we got to understand how what if acts as a sort of cognitive crowbar, prying open these fixed ideas that are usually locked up tight inside our minds. The engine behind this whole thing is something called hypothetical thinking. It's our brain's incredible superpower to kind of mentally time travel, To detach from what's happening right now and to build a detailed simulation of a world that isn't real, at least not yet. It's the absolute bedrock of planning, creativity, and strategy. So when you ask, what if, it's doing three really cool things in your brain. First, that phrase literally acts like a linguistic crowbar, forcing open these mental pathways that are usually blocked off by our sense of what's realistic. Second, it tells our inner critic to just take a break, creating this safe space for what's called divergent thinking, basically letting all the wild ideas out to play. And finally, it taps into this quirky psychological principle called the Zeigarnik effect. You know when you hear the first few notes of a song and you just have to finish it in your head? It's like that. Our brains crave closure, and an open question like, what if, creates this little mental itch that our mind is just desperate to scratch. And ultimately, this is what it all boils down to. This one little question frees our thinking from the tyranny of our current reality. It lets us stop just describing what is and start truly imagining what could be.
But hey, this isn't just about creativity and dreaming up new ideas. It's also an incredibly powerful defensive tool. It's a way to build a shield against disaster before it ever happens.
One of the most powerful techniques here is called a pre-mortem. And instead of just hoping for the best, you do the exact opposite. You get your team in a room and you start with the assumption that your project has already failed, like spectacularly. Your job is to work backward and figure out why. It's a clever psychological trick that helps bypass our brain's natural tendency to be a little too optimistic.
Okay, picture this. You're about to launch a huge new website, but in the pre-mortem, the story is already written. The launch was a complete disaster. The site crashed immediately. Now the team has to answer, what went wrong? It's a simple flip in perspective, but it uncovers all these critical flaws in the server setup, in your assumptions about user traffic, things that normal planning almost always misses. And the stakes here can be unbelievably high. Think about nuclear safety. For a long time, risk assessment focused on predictable failures. But it was asking the unthinkable question, what if a massive tsunami floods our backup generators, the exact scenario that happened at Fukushima, that forces engineers to design systems that are resilient to true catastrophes, not just common accidents? This really helps us understand the difference between simple risk and something called Nation uncertainty. See, risk is about known unknowns. You can put a number on it, like the 50-50 odds of a coin flip. But uncertainty, that's the realm of unknown unknowns. It's like trying to predict the exact weather a year from today. You can't even assign a probability. You can't manage uncertainty, you can only explore it. And you explore it by asking what if. Okay, so we've seen how what if can be a defensive shield. Now let's flip it around and look at how it becomes a powerful offensive weapon, a true engine for innovation.
For like 100 years, the entire auto industry was built on one single assumption. People want to own cars. End of story. But then a new question popped up. Wait a minute. What if ownership isn't the point? What if people just want mobility? By questioning that one single foundational belief, it blew the doors open for the entire ride-sharing industry. It created a whole new category.
So, what if battery costs dropped by 90%? A few years back, that probably would have sounded completely absurd. But asking that question forces you to see the future in a totally different light. It lets you spot a potential trillion-dollar opportunity, the complete disruption of our energy grid, way before it becomes obvious to everybody else. This is exactly the kind of thinking that fuels the world's most ambitious projects. At labs like Google X, they don't start by asking, how can we make internet cables a little bit better? No way. They start by asking, what if we could beam internet down from balloons floating in the stratosphere? For a normal linear thinker, that's a ridiculous question. But for them, that's the very definition of a moonshot. So this mindset is fantastic, right? But how do big organizations actually put it to work in a systematic way? Well, let's take a look at the strategist toolkit. A classic tool here is scenario planning, which was made famous by the oil giant Shell. Instead of trying to predict one single future, which is impossible, they create these really detailed, believable stories for several different possible futures. This makes sure their strategy is tough and ready to adapt, no matter which version of the future actually happens. And then you can take those stories and actually turn them into numbers. Scenario modeling takes a general worry, like what if the market crashes, and uses powerful simulations to map out a whole range of possible outcomes. This lets you plan for all sorts of futures, not just one single guess, and that leads to way more robust decisions.
Now for a more aggressive, really modern example. Netflix famously uses a tool they call Chaos Monkey. It's literally a piece of software that goes into their live system and intentionally kills servers. It is constantly asking, what if this part of our system dies right now? By stress testing their own infrastructure in real time, they build a system that is so incredibly resilient it can survive almost any unplanned disaster.
And of course, in the highest stakes environments you can imagine, like the military, this whole process is formalized into wargaming. They create a hypothetical battlefield to test their strategies against a smart thinking adversary. It lets them ask, what if the enemy does this unexpected thing? And learn the hard lessons of defeat in a totally safe simulation without ever paying the real-world price.
So look, here's the most crucial thing to remember. The ultimate goal of all this what-if thinking isn't to perfectly predict the future. That's a fool's errand. The real payoff, the true value, is preparedness and insight. It's about building the mental agility to react faster and smarter when a crisis actually hits, because in your mind, you've already been there.
And that brings us to the final question, the one I really want to leave you with. All of us, we operate on a set of core assumptions about our careers, our relationships, our lives. So just take a moment and ask yourself, what is the single biggest assumption you are living by? And what if it's completely wrong?